Hey folks, Happy New Year. Welcome to 2023. I'm going to start off this year with a video which I was hoping to do, start the year off with a really positive video. And unfortunately, circumstances led me into doing a video that's actually quite a dark start to the year. The dark side of Arthur C. Clarke. Now, before we start getting into it, the reason that I've done this video, it wasn't anything I was ever originally planning to do. I was interested in the differences between Stanley Kubrick's ideas about 2001: A Space Odyssey and Arthur C. Clarke's. And I've always concentrated on Kubrick's vision in the past when I've done videos about that film. But more recently, I became a lot more interested in Arthur C. Clarke's ideas and the stuff that went into the 2001: A Space Odyssey novel. So late last year, I started reading this, which is The Lost Worlds of 2001. And basically this book includes a lot of chapters that Clarke wanted to go into the 2001: A Space Odyssey novel, but Kubrick wouldn't let him. This video isn't about that book, but that's the context of how I came to a point where I started studying Arthur C. Clarke himself and trying to figure the guy out. So I became interested in what was Clarke's personal life like. Did he have relationships? Where did he live? How did he live his life? Because those kinds of things give you a reflection of why a person creates the kind of novels or movies that they do. So I was trying to gain insight there. And I'd always had a reasonable respect for Arthur C. Clarke. I gradually felt over the years that he had his head in the clouds a little bit. He was very much into this idea of transhuman immortality. Today it's known as transhumanism, this idea that humans are going to progress beyond our biological bodies and turn ourselves into machines. Clarke viewed machines as superior to organic life. So yeah, studying Clarke's personal life, I very quickly stumbled across the 1998 allegations of sex crimes, basically, that were made against Clarke by the Mirror newspaper, the Sunday Mirror newspaper here in Britain at the time. Now, I have heard little rumours over the years in forums and stuff. Oh yeah, Arthur C. Clarke was a paedophile. I've heard that before. And I've always dismissed it as garbage because I've heard so many of these rumours about celebrities. I've heard stuff about Spielberg and people swear, oh yes, Spielberg was blah, blah, blah with children. And I'm like, okay, I'll go and look into this. And then I find absolutely nothing. And the people who are making those claims have like zero evidence to put forward for it. So I've come across that stuff many times before. And so I always dismiss the stuff about Arthur C. Clarke. Also, a few years back, for those of you who are familiar with my work, who've seen my work before, you'll probably remember that I did a few videos debunking the Leaving Neverland documentary about Michael Jackson, because that documentary was absolute garbage. I've never claimed 100% that I know that Michael Jackson was absolutely innocent of everything, but I haven't found anything that strongly suggests guilt, and he did have a court case where he was cleared of all charges, and the Leaving Neverland two supposed victims have been proven to be liars through and through. And, you know, I contributed my arguments to that in a few videos as well. So the reason I'm telling you that is because I don't want you folks out there to think that I'm one of these internet people who just sort of believes any accusation of paedophilia or sex crimes that's ever made against a celebrity. There are people out there who think that virtually all celebrities are paedophiles, and I've seen no evidence for that at all. There are some, but I don't think it's any more common than it is among average people anyway. So, right, so that's a bit of context as to why I started exploring this issue. So, I started exploring the initial newspaper articles on the subject, and they were quite shocking claims were made. And so I started looking into it, and I was seeing a lot of sort of signposts that were saying, not guilty, this is bullshit. And I was seeing a lot of other signposts that were basically saying, well, yeah, probably is true. And I couldn't decide which. So I spent about 4 or 5 days researching this issue intensely, because I thought, well, I can't do any more videos about Arthur C. Clarke because I'm very interested in his pathology and why he wrote the things he did. I can't study this issue with any credibility unless I've figured out this aspect of the man's life. So I've compiled as much information as I can, reliable information as I can, and I've put it mostly into chronological order. And I'm going to give you a basic breakdown of it. Well, say a basic breakdown. It's probably going to be a fairly long video, this, because there's a lot to explore. About whether Arthur C. Clarke was guilty of, well, it's not necessarily paedophilia, it's pederasty. Because the basic allegation, the primary allegation, was that he was using rent boys. He lived in Sri Lanka for most of his life, and that he was using rent boys there, around age 14, maybe younger, and he was paying them for sex. That's the basic allegation that's been made, and that's not called paedophilia. That's called pederasty. When you're attracted to pubescent boys who are under the age of consent. Okay, so I'm going to go through my chronological notes here and give you some basic breakdown. First of all, I'm going to tell you some stuff about Clarke's personal private life that is not necessarily about the allegation issues, but it will provide some background, some psychological background especially, and some circumstantial background, which will help us to assess the actual allegations that were made. So let's get started with that. Okay, so I'll just read out some of the notes that I've made here to start off. Arthur Charles Clarke, Arthur C. Clarke, was born in 1917 in the UK. He took up science-related hobbies early in life, including astronomy, and he began writing science fiction at around about the age of 20. He also worked as a science publication editor and worked in the Royal Air Force as a radio operator for several years. By his mid-30s, he was dedicated to science fiction writing, and he'd built himself a strong reputation in the field. And he is now most well known for his collaboration with Stanley Kubrick on 2001: A Space Odyssey. So that's the most basic background on Clarke's life. Okay, so one thing that does seem to be accepted across the board about Clarke, from both his fans and the people who are accusing him of things, is that he was gay. And these days it's like, yeah, so what? Okay, big deal. Who's gay? Doesn't matter. But back then, back in the 1940s and 50s, being gay was like, big taboo, unacceptable, could ruin a person's career and so on. And so any celebrity type people who were gay, they would have to find a way to mask it and pretend that it wasn't the case. So Clarke was stuck in that position, and that in itself in no way makes him a paedophile or a pederast. Well, that's a little bit of background. I won't go over all of these sources that have claimed he was gay or Clarke's own statements about it. This is very easy to find online. There's tons of research materials have been done on this, very well sourced, and there's a lot of statements from Clarke himself. But crucially, there are no known records of Arthur C. Clarke having any heterosexual relationships, except he got married in, I think it was 1951, it might have been, or 1953. Oh yeah. Even Clarke's biography at the Clarke Foundation, which is a website you can go to about the man, it's not a website that makes any allegations. It's a website where, the people who make the site, they really, really like Clarke and respect him. So in 1953, at age 36 approximately, Arthur C. Clarke met and very quickly married a girl called Marilyn Mayfield, and she was 22 years old at the time, and apparently she already had a son. But they split up within 6 months, and this is the only reported instance of a heterosexual relationship that I've been able to find in Clarke's life. I've looked all over the place online, found no evidence of any other heterosexual relationship. Now, a lot of people have speculated online that Clarke's marriage to Marilyn Mayfield and the fact that they split up so quickly, it was like within 6 months, but apparently they didn't get actually divorced until about 11 or 12 years later. So officially, Clarke was married for 11 or 12 years to this girl, and he wasn't even in the same country as her. And their actual relationship, if they even had one, lasted about 6 months. Now, a lot of people have speculated, and I agree with them on this, that this marriage was probably what they call a lavender marriage, which is something that a lot of people used to do. Celebrities used to do it. if you were gay, you would have a sort of a fake marriage. You would get married to someone so that it looked good publicly, so that it looked like you were a straight person and not gay. And sometimes you would get like a lesbian celebrity and a gay male celebrity, and they would marry each other on the mutual understanding there was no relationship, and it was just a public cover for both of them, and they would privately go off and have their own homosexual relationships with other people. I think that's what was going on with Clark here, because there's just no other evidence I've found anywhere of him having any heterosexual relationships. So that's an interesting little bit of background there. Okay, so there are only two people that have been able to find who Clark has been rumoured or alleged to have had long-term gay relationships with. The first one was a fellow called Mike Wilson. And Clark himself has been quoted. I found this in a Sunday Times article from 1997. This is about a year before the Sunday Mirror allegations of him were published. So this was pre-allegations. And Clark was quoted as saying he met and befriended Mike Wilson in 1951. And Wilson was born in 1934, making him 17 years younger than Clark. And in 1951, when he met Clark, Wilson would have been about 17 years old and Clark would have been about 34. And the two became very close. Now, that's a bit of a strange one. It's like a very young teenage guy has only just become of the age of consent, becoming such close friends with Arthur C. Clarke, who was 34. In itself, that doesn't prove anything, but what happens between them after that is interesting. It points to a possible gay relationship between them. So the two of them moved to Sri Lanka in 1954. Sri Lanka used to be called Ceylon, or I think it was pronounced Ceylon, and then changed its name to Sri Lanka. And this is an island in the Indian Ocean. And the two of them moved there in 1954. And I remember that in 1953, Clark had got married to Madeline Mayfield. And then he moved to another country with Mike Wilson. He'd met Mike Wilson years before. Mike Wilson went off to do some military service or something, and then he hooked up with Clark again in 1954. And the two of them went to live in Australia, and they were doing scuba diving together. It was a mutual hobby they have. And I've got a picture here, which is on a few different websites. And this shows Arthur C. Clarke on the right, and this is Mike Wilson in the middle. I can't remember who the guy on the left here is. Mike Wilson in the middle, and you can see the huge age difference there between them. And the two of them had hooked up, and they'd gone scuba diving in Australia, and they were there for, I think, 2 years. And then they went in 1956 to settle in Sri Lanka, the two of them together. So why have you got this like late teens kid, this Mike Wilson, hooking up with this mid to late 30s Arthur C. Clarke? The age gap difference is important there. If they were in a relationship, then that would show that Clarke had a sort of a preference for much younger guys, in their teens. Now, Mike Wilson, in the late 1950s, he married a girl who was, I think she was a model, called Elizabeth Pereira. And Mike Wilson, if I remember rightly, he changed his name. I can't remember what he changed his name to. And he became a filmmaker in Sri Lanka. I think he was the first one to actually shoot a colour film in Sri Lanka. So if there was a gay relationship between them, then that would have ended. I assume it would have ended when Mike Wilson married this girl, Elizabeth Pereira. I assume at that point that any gay relationship would have ended between them. But Clarke and Wilson, they did continue to write books together. They used to write books about scuba diving because Arthur C. Clarke was seriously into his scuba diving. And the fact that Mike Wilson got married to a woman and then had a hetero relationship, as far as I know, for the rest of his life, that doesn't necessarily disprove that he had a gay relationship with Arthur C. Clarke. The gay thing might have just been a phase that he went through when he was younger. That sometimes happens. But I don't think we'll ever really know. But I'm mentioning this because the lack of evidence of Arthur C. Clarke having long-term relationships in his life is very important to this whole issue. So Mike Wilson is the first of two people that Clarke has been alleged to have had long-term relationships with. Here's a photo, by the way. We've got Arthur C. Clarke on the right, you've got Mike Wilson on the left, and you've got Mike Wilson's apparently then future wife, Elizabeth Pereira, sat in the middle. So whether there was some sort of love triangle weirdness going on there, I don't know. It may have just been an innocent friendship that they had. Okay, the next issue that I want to talk about, this is really important. We'll get into this before we get into the second alleged long-term gay relationship that Clarke has been alleged to have had. The fact that he moved to Sri Lanka in his 30s, and he lived there until his death when he was 90 in 2008. Now, Clarke has cited two basic reasons for moving to Sri Lanka in interviews, and one was what he said it was the miserable British weather. And I can totally understand that one. I've lived in Britain for most of my life. The winters here are miserable and cold and damp and just like grey. And a lot of people here get really down and depressed. And a lot of people move away from this country because of the winters. My brother did it. My brother went to live in Australia. And he said the main reason was the weather in Britain. So I can absolutely understand Clarke moving away for that reason, but that doesn't specify why he would have to move to Sri Lanka. He could have moved to Spain, Italy, United States. You know, there's tons of countries he could have went to. The other reason he cited was scuba diving. Him and Mike Wilson, they were both really into the diving, and they took it seriously. When they were in Sri Lanka, they did some serious work. They wrote books on scuba diving, so it was a genuine reason. However, I'm not convinced that Arthur C. Clarke would go and live in Sri Lanka specifically for the scuba diving, because there's lots of scuba diving locations you can live in. They'd already lived in Australia for 2 years and done a lot of diving stuff there. There's Mediterranean countries you can go to, you know, Greece, Italy, places like that where there's plenty of scuba opportunities. There's parts of the United States, you know, Florida, California. There's Mexico. There's plenty of Central American countries, Belize and places like that. All these different countries that Clarke could have gone to. And some of those countries he could have engaged in the scuba diving hobby. And also he could have maintained a much closer, easier relationship with the rest of the scientific community, other sci-fi writers, and journalists and so on. He could have moved regularly among all the establishment figures, because there was a lot of very rich establishment famous people who loved Arthur C. Clarke. They thought of him as an absolute visionary. And yet he buggered off to Sri Lanka, of all places, and settled down there. And apparently he was like one of the most powerful, and I think I saw some sources that said he was the richest person in Sri Lanka. Not when he got there, he wasn't super rich at the time, but after 2001 Space Odyssey, he became very rich. And so yeah, he settled in Sri Lanka. And I'm not convinced that the scuba diving was enough reason to walk away from all of the social life. And don't forget, there was no internet back then. Very hard to maintain communication with people in other parts of the world way back in the 1950s and 60s. And again, with the 1970s and 80s, you could do phone calls, you could do letters, and later on you could do faxes, but you didn't have the internet like you've got these days. And just as a comparative point, Arthur C. Clarke was known as one of the big three science fiction writers at the time, the other ones being Isaac Asimov and Robert Heinlein. And both Heinlein and Asimov, they lived in America. They stayed in America, and they maintained their relationships with the scientific community and the science fiction community in America. But Clarke, he went away to Sri Lanka. Now, the important background about Sri Lanka, this is an essential element, and it's a big question about Clarke's motives. Was Arthur C. Clarke drawn to Sri Lanka because of the differing attitudes to sex that were present in that country? Sri Lanka was, and still is, a country that appeals to paedophiles and pederasts. Now, this is an internet rumour. There have been lots of child's rights organisations, both back then at the time and today, who say that Sri Lanka is sort of a destination for Western paedophiles. You know the way Thailand is kind of a sex tourism place. People go there to have sex with prostitutes or even underage, even kids. Well, Sri Lanka's the same. I mean, there's lots and lots of links if you go searching online. There's kids' rights organisations who've named Sri Lanka as being one of the top 5 destinations for sex tourism in the world, and especially it's for sex with boys underage, because unbelievably still today, last I checked, I saw a report from 2022, in Sri Lanka, I mean, rape is illegal. If you rape anybody, as far as I know, it's illegal there. But as an adult in Sri Lanka, if you have sex with an underage girl, that is a criminal offence. I don't know if anybody ever gets actually put on trial and charged and sent to prison for it. But sex with underage boys in Sri Lanka is legal. I mean, any age. There's no age restriction on it. All you have to do, if the police even bother to investigate, all you have to do is just persuade them that the kid went along with this. It was consensual. So a full-grown man can have a sexual relationship with a young boy, even prepubescent, and as long as it's consensual, it's legal. That's the case in Sri Lanka, which is unbelievable that that's still the case today. And apparently back then, I don't know if this is still the case now, but when the government was kind of pressurised in Sri Lanka to start putting some laws in place to protect kids from sexual abuse, one of the things that they put in place, which kind of shot the whole thing in the foot, is, we're going to make it illegal to have sex with girls underage. I think it was only the girls and not the boys. But if the sex is consensual, then the kid is held equally liable legally. Now, I don't know if that means that they would send the kid to jail for having sex with an adult. But yeah, that doesn't help for allowing victims to come forward and talk about their experiences and stuff, because they'd be afraid of legal repercussions. So the whole legal situation in Sri Lanka regarding paedophilia and pederasty is unbelievable. It was true back then, and it is now. And so with the allegations that have been made against Clark, and we will get into those in detail shortly, the question has to be asked: was Clark partially drawn to Sri Lanka because of the freedom to engage in sexual activities with underage boys? Well, maybe we can answer that as we go along. So that's a little bit of background on that. This brings us to the second alleged homosexual relationship that Clark has been rumoured for many years to have had. And this is with a young guy called Leslie Ekenyaki. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Well, I hope I am. Leslie Ekenyaki. His little picture of him I'll show on screen. Okay, so the background to this is that when Arthur C. Clarke moved to Australia permanently, he became very close friends with the Ekenyaki family. So if he did have a relationship with Leslie Ekenyaki, he wouldn't have met him as like a rent boy and paid him for sex and then had a relationship with him. I don't think it would have been like that. Leslie Ekenyaki was a younger member of the Ekenyaki family who Clark had befriended because they ran a scuba diving business. Clark was into scuba diving, so they had a lot in common right away, and then Clark got involved with that. And Clark and a guy called Hector Ekenyaki, they together ran this scuba diving business, and they ran it for many years, and they took it very seriously. And from what I've read from statements from Hector and from YouTube interviews I've seen with Hector, the basic background is that Hector owned not just a scuba diving business, but he also had a very large piece of property in Colombo, which is the biggest city in Sri Lanka, which is also the sex tourism central part of Sri Lanka. On this property, Hector had basically 2 big houses, and the Ekenyaki family basically lived in one house, and Clark rented the other house on the same property from the Ekenyaki family. And that was the arrangement. So as far as I know, it stayed with that arrangement until Clark died in 2008. And as far as I know, I'm not totally sure about this, but I think that Clark's estate was left to the Ekenyaki family. It wasn't left to any family members back in Britain. And what seems to have happened here is that this sometimes happens with gay guys. Because they don't have any hetero relationships and they can't have kids, but they want to have the family experience, so they hook up with some other family. And Clark hooked up with the Ekenyaki family, and he basically became an adopted family member. And it appears from all the interviews I've seen and stuff that, you know, he was well integrated into that family, and they adored him, and apparently he adored them. Now there is a picture here which I found of Clark in old age with some of the Ekenyaki family, and the three girls in the picture, as far as I know, I think they're daughters of Hector, but apparently Clark took on these three girls and looked after them, and he treated them as if they were his own kids, apparently. The younger boy who you see in this picture, who is, this doesn't help with the allegations. You've got this young boy who's like early teens, and he's sat on Clark's lap, and Clark's got his hand on his shoulder. Now that could just be an innocent photo. You know, it could just be a brotherly or fatherly affection thing. It doesn't necessarily prove he was doing anything with this particular boy. I don't even know who this boy is, but they all look very happy there together. And so, yeah, Clark stayed with this family. Now, Leslie Ekenyaki, he was 30 years younger than Arthur C. Clarke. And Leslie also died just before his 30th birthday. It was a motorcycle accident, is what's been reported as. And the rumours about Clark having a relationship with Leslie Ekenyaki, it comes from a number of different bits of evidence. And the first one, which I'll just show on screen here, this was a sort of eulogy that Arthur C. Clarke made to Leslie about a year or two after his death. And it says, this is in the start of his book called The Fountains of Paradise. And as you can see over there on the right in the eulogy, Leslie had died the year before in 1977. So it reads, "To the still unfading memory of Leslie Ekenyaki," gives the dates of his birth and death, "only perfect friend of a lifetime, in whom were uniquely combined loyalty, intelligence, and compassion. When your radiant and living spirit vanished from this world, the light went out of many lives." And then there's some religious thing written at the bottom there. I'm not even sure exactly what that translates to. Okay, so this eulogy, some people have cited this as evidence that Clark had a gay relationship with Leslie. I'm not totally convinced of that. I'm 50-50 on it because, this could easily just be read as a family member, adopted family member eulogy to this young guy. It doesn't necessarily mean gay relationship. But there is the interesting phrase, "only perfect friend of a lifetime," which kind of like disses all of Arthur C. Clarke's other friends. It pushes all the other friendships aside and says, no, this one was the one. That's quite an intense statement. So it does kind of read like a sort of veiled confession that this guy was the love of my life, but he's not going as far as actually saying that. Like I say, I'm 50-50 on it, so I'm not sure about that. But very important, the fact that the guy was 30 years younger than Arthur as well. And here we can see that there's a plaque on the outside of the property where Clark lived with the Ekenyaki family, and it says Leslie's house. And some people have cited that and said, oh yeah, he was so in love with Leslie Ekenyaki that he put him on the plaque of the house. But it says underneath Arthur C. Clarke and Hector Ekenyaki. So, it could have been Hector who put that plaque there. So that doesn't really prove anything either. Another one that some people have cited is the gravestones. They've said that, Arthur C. Clarke is buried with Hector. Arthur C. Clarke is buried with Leslie Ekenyaki. I've heard people saying that, and that this shows that they were in a relationship together. But if you look at the picture here, you can actually see it's a family grave. Over on the right, you've got a third grave, which has got some other Ekenyaki family members. And Arthur C. Clarke, his grave is actually separate from those. It's a black tombstone, like a monolith from 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's quite funny coincidence. But yeah, it's, Leslie's gravestone has clearly got room left on it for other family members to have their names written on when they die, and Clarke's is next to them. So I don't see that as being a connection between Leslie and Arthur. And the last thing, this one is a bit more, not necessarily conclusive, but more interesting. If you go to findagrave.com, there are pages for Leslie Ekenyaki and for Arthur C. Clarke. And each of those pages specifically cites the other as their spouse. Now, I don't know who exactly wrote up these Find a Grave pages on each of these guys. A lot of very specific information is given on the pages about exact places where they were born, the dates they were born, cause of death. And yeah, this one says partner Arthur C. Clarke, and it says family members, spouse Arthur C. Clarke is listed under Leslie Ekenyaki. Now, you would think if this was inaccurate, it actually says the same on Arthur C. Clarke's page. Family members, it mentions, I think, his brother and sister, and then it says spouse Leslie Ekenyaki. Okay? Now, I don't see anything else on these pages that looks suspicious or inaccurate or anything like that. And if these two pages are inaccurate, you would think that the members of the Ekenyaki family would have gone to these pages and corrected it and said, no, he wasn't the spouse. But it's listed as that. So that doesn't prove it. It depends who wrote the pages. But again, the key thing about this whole Leslie Ekenyaki possible relationship is that, like with Mike Wilson, there's a big age gap. Okay, so Mike Wilson was 17 years old when he met Clarke, and he was 17 years younger. And when Arthur C. Clarke first moved to Sri Lanka, he would have been, well, he was 30 years older than Leslie. And Leslie would have been about 9 years old when Clarke first moved to Sri Lanka. Now, that doesn't, I'm not necessarily saying that Clarke started a relationship with him when he was like 9 or 10. I mean, it could have been years later at the age of consent if he did have a relationship with him. But if he did have a relationship, then again, the age difference is even more pronounced, 30-year difference. Yeah, so... but one other thing that's worth mentioning about this is that if Clarke had a long-term relationship with Leslie, in some ways that could go against the sex crime allegations against Arthur C. Clarke, because if he was in a relationship with Leslie, then that would, that it could be taken that he was happy in that relationship, and therefore there was no use of rent boys or anything like that. So yeah, in a way that could go in Clarke's favour. But then Leslie died in 1977 at age 30, or almost age 30, and then Clarke, there's no other evidence of Clarke having had any sexual romantic relationships with anyone, male or female, after that. So what did he do with his sex life? Was he just completely celibate? Who knows? Okay, so that's the background on Arthur C. Clarke moving to Sri Lanka, two alleged homosexual relationships, which are not proven, but there do seem to be indicators that one or both of them were true. Now let's go to the allegations that were made against Arthur C. Clarke. Now I know some of you will be watching this video and thinking, why did you take your time getting to the allegations? Well, the reason I took my time is because it's important to get the context of Clarke's life in place first before looking at the allegations, because otherwise you could just read the allegations and just instantly believe them. And I don't want to give that impression. Okay, so first article was in the Sunday Mirror on the 1st of February 1998. And this article alleged that Arthur C. Clarke had been using rent boys for sex in Sri Lanka. It didn't say he was doing it at the time in 1998 because Clarke was like, I think he was 80 years old at the time. Yeah, he was. He was about 80 years old. So, but the allegations were like going back decades before that. Now, the journalists who put together this story for the Sunday Mirror, their names were Graham Johnson, who's the primary fella, and there was a fellow before him called Roger Insull. And Roger Insull was a journalist who specialised in paedophilia stories, true crime stories, and I've read some of his stuff, what I could find. He's dead now, Roger Insull. He's deceased. But yeah, he did a lot of stuff about that, true crime and paedophilia stories. And Graham Johnson, well, Roger Insull, he was there in Sri Lanka researching Arthur C. Clarke, apparently, for quite a while, and he was gathering information about alleged pederasty, use of rent boys, underage rent boys especially, on Arthur C. Clarke's part. Now, Roger Insull worked for the News of the World newspaper, and according to Graham Johnson, in a book that he published later, we'll come to that, according to Graham Johnson, the News of the World newspaper did not want to publish the story about Arthur C. Clarke being a possible paedophile or pederast because Rupert Murdoch, who owned the News of the World newspaper, he was apparently a big fan of Arthur C. Clarke and was even friends with him, and they had contact and stuff. So apparently that's the reason the News of the World didn't want to follow up with the story. So then steps in the Sunday Mirror. Graham Johnson worked for them. The Sunday Mirror, they send Graham Johnson over to Sri Lanka to hook up with Roger Insull and look into this story and develop this story about Clarke and the sexual allegations. So that happened. And then showed up this, as a result of that, the Sunday Mirror published this first article making the allegations against Arthur C. Clarke. Now, before we get onto that, I want to mention some background on Graham Johnson, the journalist. Now, he's an interesting guy. I bought his book, which is called Hack. This was published, I think, around 2014, 2015. And at the time, there was a big major scandal in the UK about phone hacking, journalists illegally hacking people's phones to get access to their emails, their text messages, and their voicemails and so on, in order to get information about people's private lives. This turned into a big scandal back in 2014. Graham Johnson was involved in that practice for a short period of time, and he blew the whistle on it. And he actually got a suspended sentence from a court trial against him for phone hacking. So he got a suspended sentence. So he didn't. I don't think he actually went to prison. But the judge apparently commended him for blowing the whistle on the whole thing. And then he wrote this book about his experiences, his career in journalism. And it's pretty interesting. When I was reading through the book, because it's got a 3-page section in there that talks about the Arthur C. Clarke allegations and how that story developed. And Johnson, I haven't read the whole book, but Johnson talks about a lot of the bad practices that went on in various news organisations where he worked, and fabricated stories and things like that. And he talks later in the book about he started getting into reading Noam Chomsky's assessments of the news media, and that had a transformative effect on him, and he sort of reformed himself. And nowadays he campaigns for news media reform. He's got some website called Byline Investigates, I think it's called. So anyway, I was reading Johnson's book, and I was quite taken back by the abrasive writing, very in-your-face writing, not written like an academic, a lot of swearing, a lot of big, bold, emotional language, and it's very much a street talk book. So I was thinking, bloody hell, who the hell is this guy, this journalist? He's got a bit of an attitude, and kind of in a good way. So I looked him up, and it turned out he's from the same city as me. He's from Liverpool. He's what we call a Scouser or a Liverpudlian. And I thought, oh yeah, that makes sense, because this is a city where a lot of people speak their mind, and they're not afraid to, they don't feel the need to dress up their explanations of things with carefully couched language. When people in this city have got something to say, they typically say it straight to your face, and they don't mince the words. So I was like, yeah, okay, that makes sense that he would be from Liverpool. So he's a bit of a character, Graham Johnson. There's a Wikipedia page on him, and it seems that early in his career he was involved in some bad news organisations and got involved in some bad practices, and then he later sort of reformed. And this is an interesting thing, is that his descriptions of his reforming occurred after the Arthur C. Clarke allegations were made. So that in itself doesn't really support the allegations very much. He did stories on child slavery in India, and he wrote this book, Hack, and he's wrote a handful of other books, and I think he's wrote some novels as well. So you can go and find stuff about him online, and there's reviews of his books that you can go and look up. And in 2005, he was nominated for a major journalism award. Like I said, he was involved in the phone hacking scandal. So of the two journalists who did the initial investigation, which led to the Sunday Mirror's first published allegation against Clarke, the first one, as I said, Roger Insull, he's deceased, he's gone, so we can't contact him. But Graham Johnson is still alive, and he's still doing his thing. And so I emailed him in the hope that he'd get back to me. I thought, well, I'm a fellow Liverpudlian. Maybe that will entice him, make him more willing to respond. And he responded pretty quickly, and he invited me to have a phone call with him, so I did. And we got on very, very well. And he told me in his email that he'd been watching my videos for years, which was quite cool. I thought, well, that's good. That enticed him to get in touch with me as well. Because for those of you who aren't familiar with my work, I normally do film analysis, film studies. And Graham Johnson said in his email that he's been watching them for years, and he was a big fan of them. You could say maybe he made that up in order to win me over to his side, but don't really see any evidence for that. But I'll let you speculate about that as much as you will. So anyway, I chatted on the phone with Johnson for about 30 or 40 minutes. It may have even been an hour. It was a long discussion, and he was very open. And I asked him all about how the entire investigation went in Sri Lanka, why it happened, who they were interviewing and questioning, and so on. And he gave me the basic similar rundown that he gives in the Hack book. And the rundown also sort of matches up with a lot of the published allegations that went out in the time in the newspapers. And when I was asking him the questions over the phone, he was very rapid with his answers. I didn't get any impression that he was holding things back or trying to make things up or anything like that. Unless you wanted to assume it was a very well-versed lie. But I think if he was going to be a liar, I think he just would have not responded to my email at all. But he was so willing to get in touch and have this long conversation. And he swears that everything that he described about this investigation was true. Of course, that wouldn't pass in a court of law. That would be called hearsay. Okay, so the background of the investigation, what they did in Sri Lanka, was that Roger Insull directed Graham Johnson to some beaches where the Western paedophile sex tourists were known to go to pick up rent boys and that kind of thing. And so Johnson and Insull, or it might have been Johnson on his own, I can't remember if it was both of them or one of them, went to these beaches. And Johnson only had like a 24-hour window to gather all the information, that's what he said, and get the story out. And there's reasons for that 24-hour window that are quite interesting. We'll come back to that. So Johnson told me over the phone, and this is what it says in the published allegations as well, that he went to the beaches, he interviewed various men, asking them about Arthur C. Clarke, and that he found a handful of men who described their earlier rent boy experiences. This is like pubescent, age 13, 14, 15, maybe 17 as well. and that they described having sexual encounters with Clark and being paid money for it. And there was three published allegations of that kind that were part of the original first article that went out, and the guys are specifically named. Their names and ages are given, and each of them is quoted as talking about the specific ages at which they were supposed to have had these sexual encounters with Clark. Now, an interesting thing about that is, if these men had not been named in the initial allegation article, then we could just brush it off and say, oh, well, the journalists made that up. But the three men were specifically named and their ages were given. And, when journalists are going to make things up completely, often, it's like, oh, a source who didn't want to be named said blah, 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 blah. And then they can just insert any old shit and just say, oh, well, the source didn't want to be known. But they actually named these three sources, so if this was a made-up allegation, then it's a pretty bold thing to make up by naming men who either don't exist or didn't say what they said. So apparently Johnson had these interviews with these guys, and then he had some interviews with some older men from around the island who knew Clark, and apparently they spilled the beans on Clark and, just revealed and said, yeah, we've known, he's a paedophile. That's what Johnson told me, that there was men who knew Clark who were happy to reveal what he was up to. Why they wanted to reveal these things about Clark, I don't know. But it's worth noting that Clark was so respected and so admired in Sri Lanka that the local newspapers hardly covered the allegations against Clark, even when the rest of the world's news media were starting to cover it. The Sri Lankan news media almost completely kept a lid on it. So I guess you could say that the people who spoke out only did so because it was non-Sri Lankan Western sources who were covering the issue, so they knew that it would actually get coverage in the newspapers, and that those sources didn't see any point to talking to the Sri Lankan news media about it. So that's an interesting possibility there. And Johnson told me that the information they had wasn't quite enough. They needed something a bit more conclusive. So Clark told me that he went to, Johnson told me that he went to Clark's house. And he was initially not allowed entry by the I think he said there was a guard or family members and they wouldn't let him in. So we went and bought loads of flowers, went back to the house and told everybody, I'm here to congratulate Arthur C. Clarke about his upcoming knighthood. The knighthood thing is very important in all this. Arthur C. Clarke was due to get knighted by Prince Charles in Sri Lanka either a few days later or the next week. Sorry, a slight distraction there, folks. I was dying for a cup of tea, and it's a nice opportunity for me to drop a little bit of product placement for my merchandise. You got the Collative Learning Cup there. You got t-shirts and stuff that are available. There's a link on my website to get access to have a look at these merchandise items. I mention it because my girlfriend keeps saying to me, Rob, you don't promote your merchandise stuff enough. Mention it more. I'm like, okay, I will. So I'm doing it now. So yeah, cups, t-shirts, things like that. Follow the link in the video description to access that stuff. Right, so where were we up to? Prince Charles was about to knight Arthur C. Clarke, and the Sunday Mirror journalists, Roger Insull and Graham Johnson, they had a 24-hour window to get this story out. Now, Johnson admits in this book that the motivation to try and get the story out so quickly was to sort of to ruin the knighthood for for Arthur C. Clarke, and to embarrass Prince Charles. It's more or less admitted in that book. He words it very. Let me see if I can find the quote actually. Okay, I'm going to read out Johnson's own description of this from his book, because this can be taken to support the allegation that some have made that that the story about Clarke was basically an attack on Prince Charles and to destroy Arthur C. Clarke's reputation as well and ruin his knighthood. Doesn't prove it's the case, but I think if there was a court a court trial over it, I think this would get quoted. Okay, so I'll read it out to you. We'd been tipped off that the wank on the biscuit shape-shifting secret rulers of the world were gonging Arthur up the following week. So you can see there's a lot of humour in how he describes this stuff. In the New Year's list, Prince Charles was coming to Sri Lanka himself to do the honours. Once again, the synchronicity was sublime. In the finest of Fleet Street traditions, the big plan was to fuck the whole thing up for all of the nonces and their establishment cronies. A nonce is a UK slang term for a paedophile, or a pedophile as you Americans call it. For all the nonces and their establishment cronies, all at once, put a bomb under the fucking lot of them, in one great big mass of piss all over their weirdo parade. But was our dynamite good enough to do the job? Okay, so that's like a very abrasive description of the motives. And this can be taken as being evidence that there was a sort of a motivation to fake the story. However, it doesn't necessarily prove that's the case, because if Johnson and Insull had fabricated their evidence about Clarke, then surely they wouldn't want to incriminate themselves, or Johnson wouldn't want to incriminate himself by describing his motives in that way, or describing the newspaper's motives in that way. So the fact that he's so upfront and open about that motive suggests to me that the motive was there, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the allegations that were made against Clarke in the paper were fabricated. If they were fabricated, then why admit that kind of motivation? That's an interesting, strange dynamic about this. So, wanting to give the story more solidity, Johnson goes to Arthur C. Clarke's house, gains entry by claiming that he's there with a bunch of flowers to congratulate Clarke about his upcoming knighthood, and apparently that gained him entrance. And I think that really did gain him entrance, because years later, when Clarke was trying to dismiss the claims, he did actually admit in a Guardian article, he was quoted as stating that two journalists did come to his house and did interview him, but he said he was misquoted about what he said to those journalists. So he admits that they did come to the house. So I think Johnson was honest about this. And so Johnson went in. And also the fact that Clarke said that two journalists came to his house, that tells me that it was Graham Johnson and Roger Insull. They went together to Clarke's house to interview him, and they went there to confront him about these allegations. Now, what was published in the original article, and which is also in Johnson's book, and which he also told me over the phone, was that when they went into Clarke's house, you know, he was old and he was in bed upstairs, and they went up to the bedroom and they interviewed him in there. And initially they did this sort of, congratulations about the upcoming knighthood and all that, trying to inflate his ego and butter him up. And then Johnson started challenging him about the pederast or paedophile allegations. And apparently Clarke completely denied it to begin with. And then Johnson started reeling off the names of the boys, the men that he'd spoken to, who claimed that they were molested as young boys, as rent boys. So Graham Johnson apparently recorded this conversation with Clarke, secretly recorded it. Clarke didn't know he was being recorded. And by reading out, apparently he challenged him about these allegations of having sexual relations with underage boys, using rent boys. And apparently Clarke initially denied it. And then when Johnson started naming the men who had accused him of this, talking about when they were younger, having sexual experiences with Clarke, apparently Clarke then started to break down a little bit about it and started to reluctantly admit that he'd had a boy of around about age 14. And there's various quotes given in the initial article about Clarke trying to justify sex with pubescent boys or boys of around age 13 or 14 and so on. And I'll show a little bit of that on screen. I won't bother reading it all out. You can have a little look for yourself. And so, yeah, apparently this discussion with Clarke was recorded, and Clarke made admissions and tried to make excuses for it. That's what the Sunday Mirror claimed in their reporting, and they give a lot of quotes about what Clarke apparently said. Okay, now, an important thing about this is really important. The supposed audio recording of Clarke making these statements has never surfaced publicly. This is absolutely crucial. The newspaper claimed to have had it. They gave transcripted portions of the audio recording. And as time went on and other organisations started to cover it, requests were made from the Sunday Mirror and the Mirror and the Sunday Mirror, which were the same newspaper organisation. It's just two different newspapers they ran. Requests were made of them to provide copies of these tapes, or this particular tape. And apparently it was never supplied. I've never found any evidence of the tape's existence. It's claimed to have existed. And this doesn't necessarily disprove all of the allegations against Clarke, because as we're going to see shortly, there have been other allegations that come from other sources besides the Mirror newspapers. But the fact that this tape has never surfaced, and you would expect that it would be on the internet. I mean, you've got there's old video clips of, or at least one video clip of Sean Connery talking about, trying to justify domestic violence against women. Big embarrassing statements from Sean Connery, but he's there on camera saying it in the clips, so it's hard to deny that he actually said it, unless you went down the route of saying somebody faked the clips, but I can't really see that. But you would expect today, with the existence of the internet and so on, that somebody would have a copy of this tape at one of the newspapers or one of the journalists, and that they would have put it up on YouTube years ago to say, look, here is Arthur C. Clarke, admitting to these crimes and trying to justify them. But this tape has still never surfaced. And I asked Graham Johnson over the phone. First I asked him by email, and then when he invited me to have a phone call with him, I asked him over the phone. And he said that he did have a copy for years, but, it was like 25 years ago, approximately, that the story broke. And so he lost the tape along the way, or he must have thrown it out with some old possessions or something. After 25 years, that is plausible. But at the same time, if he did have it, I don't know exactly when he apparently got rid of the tape, but why didn't he put it out on YouTube? Maybe there's some legal thing to prevent him. He was talking about the possibility of legal action from Arthur C. Clarke prevented the tape from being published. That's possible. There may have been some deal between the Mirror newspaper group and Arthur C. Clarke. There may have been some behind-the-scenes deal that was worked out between the lawyers to say, okay, keep this tape suppressed and don't publish anything more, and we won't sue you publicly. There may have been something like that, I don't know. But he told me that the tape was never made public because the paper and the journalists themselves didn't want to get sued by Arthur C. Clarke because he had a lot of money, he could afford expensive lawyers and so on. So I'm not really sure about this, but the absence of this tape publicly is a problem for these allegations. Okay, so I thought I'd make that very clear before we continue on. Okay, so I will actually read out some of the quotes that are attributed to this tape. Asked about supposedly admitting sexual relationships with at least one 14-year-old, Clarke apparently stated, quote, "I am all in favour of efforts to stop it, but how do we stop it without interfering with the rights of responsible adults? I think most of the damage comes from the fuss made by hysterical parents afterwards. If the kids don't mind, fair enough," end quote. Bit of a heavy thing for Clarke to apparently say to a journalist, and he was like 80 years old at the time. You could say that maybe his marbles were going and his defences had been lost or something, you know. And he was asked about a Swiss tycoon paedophile that had operated in Sri Lanka, and this would have been a guy called Victor Bauman, and this guy was actually investigated, and there was a court trial about it. He was accused of molesting thousands of kids, and one of the kids apparently died somewhere in Europe. So a bit of a dark episode to look into. You go and look that one up online if you want. Victor Bauman, Bauman. Big, you know, super rich guy, paedophile, operated in Sri Lanka and other places. And apparently Clarke was asked by Graham Johnson, did you attend this guy's parties in his house? And Clarke is quoted in the first allegation article as saying, quote, I may well have done. I mean, the very first man I met here in 1954 was a paedophile and made no bones about it. He was in intelligence in the army, a fantastic guy, end quote. Again, it seems weird that Clarke would make such self-incriminating statements to a journalist, whether he thought he was being recorded or not. So also the Sunday Mirror's article, the first one, it claims that Clarke used to go to a place called the Otter Aquatic Club. And I've looked on Google Maps and I've identified exactly the house where Clarke lived in Colombo, which was from the Hekanyaki family, where he lived there with them. And it was a very short, like 5-minute drive or so, or maybe a 10 or 15-minute walk to the Otter Aquatic Club. And apparently Clarke used to go there almost daily to play table tennis, and he'd play table tennis against teenagers there. Now, the Sunday Mirror article claimed that the Otter Aquatic Club was a notorious haunt for Western paedophiles. I haven't been able to find any other verification that that's what the club was all about. So that was the one that I've got a question mark on. However, it has been confirmed by other news media sources that Clarke did attend the Otter Aquatic Club. There was a couple of times where he actually took journalists with him to watch him playing table tennis with young people at that club. One of those was a journalist pre-allegations he took there, and one of them was about a year afterwards. So yeah, it does look like he did actually go there, but doesn't necessarily mean that the Mirror's claim that it was a haunt for paedophiles was true. Oh yeah, there was one more essential thing. Fairly famous in Sri Lanka, radio broadcasting personality, radio presenter, a fellow called Dayanandi De Silva, and his name is misspelt in the Sunday Mirror article. He apparently told Graham Johnson that... well, I'll read out the quote. It says, quote, Arthur seems attracted to the rough, unsophisticated 17 and 18-year-olds, although I know he has sampled much younger ones. Arthur likes casual affairs with lots of different boys. He gets a lot of pleasure by moving with the teenage lifesavers. They are between 15 and 17. I have even sent Arthur boys. He shares the same tastes as me. It's a strange thing to say. It's a strange admission from this guy. If I think he might like one of the boys, I give them his phone number. He asked me to. The last time I saw Arthur a few months ago, he was still having casual sex with boys. This would be when Clarke was around age 80. The boys do it for money, and money is nothing to Arthur C. Clarke, end quote. Now, something I'm not sure about this is Dayanandi De Silva apparently saying these things. I don't know if he was aware that he was making these statements to a journalist. It's possible that Johnson or the other journalist, Roger Insull, it's possible that they did not reveal themselves to be journalists and therefore they got these quotes from him. But the fact that they published these quotes in the Sunday Mirror from this guy and named him specifically a famous person in Sri Lanka, I find that interesting, because if the Sunday Mirror had fabricated these quotes, if the journalists had fabricated it, then you would expect that they would not attribute those quotes specifically to a famous person in Sri Lanka, because then that famous person could just come out and say, I never said any of that, this is bullshit, and that would, kill the credibility of the story. So that's an interesting one. Question marks on that. Yeah, there's a Wikipedia page on Dayananda de Silva. Unfortunately, he died as well. So I would have loved to have contacted him and asked him for more information and verification. It would have been good to get a statement from him by email or by phone to say, look, I did actually say that and I was published accurately or not. As far as I know, Dayananda de Silva never ever went public to say, no, I never made these statements. So that's an interesting thing. Okay, so that was the 1st of February 1998, that first article, and that blew the whole story open. The next day, the Mirror newspaper, which, the same organisation, they ran the two newspapers, Sunday Mirror and the Mirror. As far as I know, it's the same organisation. On the 2nd of February, the following day, two more articles were published that I've found, which put even more allegations forward. So the first one includes more supposed quotes from Clarke. It must have been a fairly in-depth audio recording that they made, because more quotes are given. Like one of them, asked about the age of boys he had liaisons with, Clarke said, quote, most of them had reached puberty, end quote. That's a hell of a submission. If Clarke did make that statement, he must have been, his marbles must have gone by that point to make a statement like that to a journalist. And then the Mirror quotes Arthur C. Clarke's younger brother, who was 76 at the time, Frederick Clarke, and it states, quote, the poor bugger can't even stand up. I can hardly see him cruising in his wheelchair for young boys. I can't accept that these allegations are correct. Arthur is paralysed in one leg and one arm. An important thing about that is that the allegations that were published the day before did not claim that the victims were current victims. The quotes came from men who claimed to have been abused a decade or two earlier. So that kind of dismissal doesn't quite work. And then Frederick Clarke, Arthur C. Clarke's brother, the quotation continues, quote, I don't believe he is physically capable of these things. He's been surrounded by nurses and staff for years. And this is an important one if it's an accurate quote, and I don't know if it is. He may have had an interest in young boys years ago. I don't know whether he ever indulged it or not. End quote. If Clarke's own brother made that statement, it's not exactly the greatest defence of Arthur. So, yeah. And then Clarke himself is quoted as claiming that the whole story is a political hatchet job aimed against himself and designed to embarrass Prince Charles and deny him his knighthood. He claims to have been smeared. Now, I think what may have happened there is the day before the first allegations were put out, if Arthur C. Clarke was quick on the ball to have his lawyers contact the Mirror and say, what the hell's going on here with these allegations? What are you doing publishing this stuff? Then or if Clarke contacted them themselves, then it's possible that the Mirror newspaper basically decided, oh, well, we'll publish Arthur C. Clarke's denials and his point of view. And this is something that very often happens in journalism. A particular news organisation will publish a really harsh allegation against someone, and they will try to defend themselves from defamation legal action by including later some statements by the party who they have defamed or exposed, giving that person's point of view. So that's called balanced journalism. And so a lot of news organisations, from what I've seen, they reluctantly publish the denials and the point of view of the person who they are publishing allegations about. In this case, they published Clarke's supposed point of view the day after. They didn't publish it as part of the initial allegation. Okay, so... And Clarke himself is quoted as saying he's not capable of these things because of his age and his physical disabilities at that age. But again, that doesn't address that the supposed victims were talking about events from a decade or two earlier. Now, I haven't found any documented evidence that Clarke ever did actually take legal action against the Mirror newspapers. Um, I'm not aware that he ever did that, and it doesn't mean it didn't happen though. And there was definitely never a court case. I mean, well, for one thing, he was in Sri Lanka, and the newspaper was in Britain. And then you've got jurisdiction, cross-border laws and stuff like that. That kind of gets complex. If you're trying to sue somebody who's in another country and the laws are different between the two countries, that can create all kinds of complexities. And Arthur C. Clarke was very old. He was 80 years old, and he might not have wanted to engage in a big court case that could drag on for years and cost a hell of a lot of money. So the fact that he didn't sue the paper does not prove that the allegations were true, but it's a noteworthy point. However, I will mention at this point as well that all of the publications by the Mirror were all put out in a single week, well, in an 8-day period. And after that, they completely ceased for reasons unknown. And I expect that there may have been some sort of a legal behind-the-scenes wrangling between Clarke and the newspaper, and some sort of agreement may have been made, a private agreement between them, which sometimes that's called a Tomlin order, and it's recognised by a court. If somebody is threatening to take legal action against somebody, and they begin the process of legal action, which is all done on paper to begin with, and then if there's a settlement agreement between the two, which doesn't always involve financial aspects, sometimes there can just be an agreement to cease publishing an allegation, and then the court would recognise that and close the case down, and it would be called a Tomlin order, and that is generally done privately, and those kinds of agreements aren't made public. So that could have happened, because I find it interesting that all of these allegations from the Mirror, not necessarily the other sources, all came over an 8-day period and then completely stopped. Okay, now the third article that went out, and this was the second one that went out on the 2nd of February 1998. So you had the one on the 1st of February, and you had two of them on the 2nd of February. And this is the second one from the Mirror on the same day. And this one gives more extensive quotes from Dayananda De Silva, the famous broadcasting guy in Sri Lanka. I'll read out these quotes. Quote, "For a while I was the only person who Arthur discussed his views with. He had a lot of pornographic literature. He used to show me a book full of snaps of young boys and girls aged between 13 and 17. Some of the boys were Sri Lankan, others were white. I presumed the white boys were from London. All of them were good looking and athletic. He told me he was attracted to Sri Lankan boys because of their dark skin and slender builds. Some of the boys were attracted to his status. Over here, the locals have deified Arthur and he is treated like a saint." And it continues on. "He gets very excited in the presence of young boys. Not long ago, Arthur was giving a speech and there was a group of schoolboys in the audience. They were interested in science and wanted to meet the great man. They had stars in their eyes. When I told Arthur, he was over like a shot. I could see his eyes light up. He was looking at them in a very devilish way." End quote. So again, these you got more quotes attributed to Dayananda De Silva. There is a point here where some of this matches up, and that one of the three men who were quoted to have had early teen sexual relationships with Clarke in the first article that went out, one of them talked about being shown photographs of young boys by Clarke as a precursor to sex, and Dayananda De Silva talks about that in his statements here too. That doesn't necessarily prove it's true. I mean, who knows? Maybe Dayananda De Silva had some sort of personal vendetta against Clarke, and he may have read the initial published article and then made his own statements match up with it. That's a possibility. That's a huge question. Dayananda De Silva, why did he go public with the Sunday Mirror with all these statements about Clarke, who was apparently his friend? Why would he do that? Okay, so after those articles went out, even if those articles had intentionally misquoted people or made things up, what happened as a result of that is it triggered those initial allegations by the Sunday Mirror or the Mirror. Those allegations triggered more statements from other people, and these other people tended to have a bit more credibility. Okay, so also on the 2nd of February, which is the day after, there's a website called Rediff on the Net, which is an Indian online news network. Back then in 1998, online news media was kind of a newish thing. So Rediff on the Net was a fairly new online, I think it was online only news source, but it was a big one. It was well known. It wasn't just some forum or something. It was an actual news organization. There's a Wikipedia page on them. So Rediff on the Net responds to the Mirror's statements about Clarke and the supposed quotes from him. It repeats some of that. And then the Rediff on the Net article, they spoke to someone called Maureen Seneviratne. Maureen Seneviratne. I don't know how to pronounce that. Well, anyway, she was a well-known children's rights campaigner, and she operated in Sri Lanka. I think she's still alive today. And she's quoted in the article as being, quote, coordinator for a non-governmental organisation called PEACE, Protection of Environment and Children Everywhere. And then Maureen goes on to talk about the problems with Sri Lankan laws regarding people having sex with minors and so on. And she actually states at one point that she had heard rumours about Clarke for some time. So this is a more credible source we've got here. You could say that she was just reacting to the Mirror's statements about Clarke. She was just overreacting to that. You could say that, but I don't know. She seems to have credibility. Next up, 4 days later, the Independent newspaper here in Britain on the 6th of February 1998, they put out an article. And they confirmed that Prince Charles did indeed go to Sri Lanka, and he met Arthur C. Clarke at a social gathering. Remember, this is a completely different newspaper to the Mirror newspaper group. And it quotes some denials from Clarke, but the article does, and the quotes from Clarke don't actually debunk any specific details. And the Independent newspaper claims, and I'll quote this, quote, Graham Johnson was allegedly sacked from the News of the World for fabricating an encounter with the Beast of Bodmin. Now, the Beast of Bodmin wasn't like a paedophile or anything. The Beast of Bodmin was a supposed panther cat that was roaming the moors or something in Britain, and apparently Graham Johnson had wrote some fake article about that, and that's what the Independent newspaper was saying. I don't know how true that is. Right, bear with me a minute. It's actually, as I'm recording this video, it's starting to get a little bit darker outside, so I'm going to put one of the lights on here. Okay, so the Independent newspaper states at one point, quote, in Sri Lanka, Clarke's reputation remains almost entirely intact. The Mirror story was reported only on one radio programme. Newspapers have carried nothing about the allegations. In the Lanka Monthly Digest's Golden Jubilee special on the 50 greatest Sri Lankans since independence, Sir Arthur C. Clarke, as he is styled, is the only foreign-born resident to be featured. Now, at this point, Clarke hadn't even been knighted, and yet he was being called Sir Arthur C. Clarke. So, you know, this is a completely separate newspaper that is alleging, it seems to be alleging, that the Sri Lankan news media are intentionally not covering the allegations against Clarke. All right, so next article. There's a lot of stuff going on with this, and I know I've dragged this out a bit, but I'm sure you'll understand by now, or by the time we get to the end of this video, why I need to go into all the various details, because this is one hell of a puzzle to try and solve. The very next day, on the 7th of February 1998, there was an article put out by the Daily Mail here in Britain. Again, you know, all these different newspapers, they have different reputations for truth and honesty. The Daily Mail gets a bad reputation, and from what I've seen over the years, yes, sometimes they do put out some really dodgy and what would you call it, sensationalist stuff, and stuff that I don't consider to be very honest. But at the same time, sometimes the Daily Mail do put out stuff that is worth reading and is good, and sometimes they report on things that some of the other newspapers won't. I don't really generally believe that there's any such thing as a reliable media source. As far as I can tell, all of the news organisations, whether they're left-wing, right-wing, globalist, nationalist, whatever, all of them lie at some point, all of them cherry-pick at some point, and all of them tell the truth at some point. So you can't just say, well, this article is worth reading because it's by this news organisation, this one we should just ignore. It doesn't really work like that. You have to take each story on its own merits. Each specific published article has to be taken on its own merits, and you investigate the details and find out whether it's full of it or not. Okay, so the Daily Mail. Now, this one you cannot find in an online search. I'd heard about this article mentioned elsewhere, but I think it was in a forum posting, but I didn't want to go ahead and talk about it unless I found the actual original article. Fortunately, the British newspaper archive.co.uk is a very good source for news stories. So I went on there, signed up, started an account, and I found this Daily Mail article, which you cannot find anywhere online. So I'm going to show it on screen. And like I said, it's from the British newspaper archive. So if you don't believe me about the existence of this article, you can always go to their website, sign up and look it up for yourself. It's on there. And if I was going to fabricate this article, it would be quite a bit of effort on my part to do this, if I was going to do that. Okay, so this article is by a woman called Angela Lambert. And well, the reason I got onto this is because Clark complained about her coverage in one of his published responses where he refuted the allegations. He said he was very disappointed with Angela Lambert's report at the Daily Mail. So that ironically drew my attention to it and made me go and get a copy. And she says that she spent 3 days with Arthur C. Clarke not long before the allegations were published. She spent 3 days with him, and she said that Clarke insisted that she travel everywhere with him. And she described him as, in this article, as, quote, one of the most repellent, vain, domineering and egotistical men she has ever met. That's a quote, end quote. That's what it says in the article. She's also quoted as saying that he is, quote, monstrously self-centered and self-satisfied. And she talks about Clarke having an ego chamber in his home. Now, this is true. Clarke had these rooms in his house, and we'll cover this in some video footage later, which I found on YouTube. He had this part of his house, and I mentioned this earlier, where it was basically a shrine to himself. And it was also seemed to be designed to impress visitors. If a journalist came to his house, Clarke could show all of these awards and plaques and all these books he'd had published and stuff. And he would show the journalists as like his way of saying, look, aren't I great? So she complains about the ego chamber and his obsessive self-vanity. She also states, quote, he is waited on hand and foot by 4 good-looking male secretaries, and a host of valets and servants man the front door, the stairs, the kitchen, his bedroom, the garden, end quote. That sounds like a lot of servants. And there have been, I suspect she may have been exaggerating the number of them there, but there have been other journalists that I've read about in some other articles who've described visiting Clarke, and that he had these young guys who basically ran around after him and did stuff for him and, waited on him. And Clarke took her to the table tennis club, the Otter Aquatic Club. At least I'm pretty sure it's the Otter Aquatic Club. Oh yeah, that was the place where he was supposed to be propositioning children and getting rent boys and stuff like that. But the journalist Graham Johnson told me that he would also prowl the beaches to do that, certain beaches. But he didn't say the names of the beaches. I wouldn't expect him to remember after 25 years. Now, Angela talks about the youths at this Otter Aquatic Club pandering to Clarke and running around after him, and that he would play them all in table tennis and beat them all the time. And She also talks in the article saying that Clark would frequently comment on the beauty of children he spotted, some around ages 8, 7 or 8. This isn't exact quotes, by the way. You'd have to check out the article. Like I say, I'll put that on screen. And she says he was, quote, blatantly excited, end quote, at the sight of them, these young children. And she quotes Clark. She talks about Clark's closeness with the Ekanyaki family. And she attributes this exact quote to Clark. Quote, I've been a cuckoo in the nest of many happy families, end quote. A strange statement. Now, I don't know whether Angela Lambert had kept all of these quotes from Clark written down ever since she visited him. I mean, as far as I know, she never published about them until after she'd seen the Mirror allegations. And she also claims that he's the most wealthy and well-known person on the island, and when she asked people about the rumours of his sexual activity with minors, the people described him as protected. Okay, so these are like some quite harsh allegations against Clark. And again, this isn't the Mirror newspaper. This is a separate newspaper entirely, the Daily Mail. But again, the question here I have is, why did she never publish this stuff about Clark? Why did she not publish it until after the Mirror had published? Maybe she felt she didn't have the justification to publish it. Maybe she felt she didn't have enough evidence. So that's an important question. All right, so next up, remember the article I was talking about before from the 6th of February 1998 by the Independent newspaper, and they commented on the almost complete lack of media coverage of the allegations within Sri Lankan media, which sort of implied that the news media there were deliberately covering up. Well, 2 days after that, the Sri Lankan Sunday Times finally covered the issue. This is 1 week after the allegations. They put 2 articles out. And the first one talked about, it basically, as far as I can tell, it kind of offered a denial. It encouraged Clark's denial. Although it did say, and I'll quote here, Dr. Clark has consistently avoided giving press interviews after the report was published. When the Sunday Times called on his office, a person named Tony answered the telephone and informed us that Dr. Clark was resting and did not wish to be disturbed. He also said that Dr. Clark is seeking legal advice in an attempt to disprove the statements, end quote. So that's interesting. They didn't completely cover for Clark. They basically were stating that Clark went into hiding for a week after the allegations were put out. Now that Clark going quiet on the subject doesn't necessarily prove guilt. He may have been under legal advice not to say anything. You know, a lot of the time, lawyers, if somebody's thinking of suing a publication for what they've said, I think sometimes the lawyers will take over and will say, don't say anything to the news media. You don't want to say anything that makes this thing worse. You don't want to say anything that gives it false credibility. Although you would also expect sometimes the lawyers on behalf of a person like Clark, the lawyers would come out and make a public statement for them. That often happens. And as far as I know, that didn't happen with Clark. I've no idea who his lawyers were, if he even had any. Now, this Sri Lankan Sunday Times article also, it claims that child's rights groups in Sri Lanka have been calling for an investigation into Clark. And it includes a statement by a fellow called Arun Tampoe, Tampoe, and apparently he's an attorney at law and child's rights activist, in other words, a lawyer for kids. Quote, Tampoe also recalled that another British tabloid had come to Sri Lanka to inquire into Dr. Arthur C. Clarke a few months ago, end quote. Now, I would assume that would have been Roger Insull for the News of the World, and News of the World didn't run the story. Okay, now, another interesting thing about this piece is that being that some of the worst statements about Clark had been made by a well-known radio broadcaster in Sri Lanka called Dayananda De Silva. We've already looked at some of the quotes attributed to him. And you would expect if the Sri Lankan Sunday Times was going to address this whole allegation that they would speak to Dayananda de Silva and get some confirmation or denial from him about whether the quotes that were attributed to him in the Mirror were accurate. And here's what they had to say about it in the Sri Lankan Sunday Times. Quote, further, the Mirror on Sunday and Monday carry disclosures by a senior journalist in state media who was alleged to have said that Dr. Clarke had a lot of pornographic material and had once shown him a book full of snapshots of young boys and girls, some Sri Lankan, others European, end quote. Now, that is almost certainly referring to Dayananda de Silva's statements. Why doesn't the Sri Lankan Sunday Times mention his name specifically? And why doesn't it carry any kind of statement to say, oh, we've spoken to Dayananda de Silva and he has confirmed that he was quoted accurately or misquoted? Why doesn't it include that? It would not have been difficult for the Sri Lankan Sunday Times to get hold of Dayananda de Silva and get some sort of statement from him. They don't even state that they tried to get hold of him. So that's very suspicious. Smacks of some sort of effort to keep damage control or something like that, you know. And then the second article in the Sri Lankan Sunday Times is basically a defence of the Otter Aquatic Club, claiming that there's nothing wrong with the place, there's no paedophilia or rent boy stuff going on there. It's all happy families who go there, and it's got a membership exceeding 5,000 people, including persons from the ages of 2 to 90 years. And it gives quotes from, I think he's one of the guys who ran the Otter Aquatic Club, and he was saying it was all an effort to discredit Dr. Clarke and the Otters Club. Although I don't see any reason why a British newspaper would... newspaper, that's a good one, isn't it? I don't see any reason why a British newspaper would feel the need to try and discredit a club in Sri Lanka that no one's ever friggin' heard of over here. I don't see why they'd have a vendetta against that particular club. So, you know, you got the two articles there, and it's not much coverage at all, and it doesn't really expand on the story very much at all. Okay, so now a follow-up article in the Sunday Mirror on 8th of February 1998, and as far as I know, this is the very last publication that the Sunday Mirror made about Arthur C. Clarke, and this one gets even worse. Okay, so this is on the same day that the two Sri Lankan newspaper articles, the Sri Lankan Sunday Times, were published. The very same day, Sunday Mirror publishes this one, and This article is attributed to Roger Insull, who was the groundwork reporter who originally did all the research on Clarke in Sri Lanka. He was there in Sri Lanka doing the research, and his information was the basis for the story. So the article is described in the online source that I found, the copy of it, as being written by Roger Insull and a woman called Tracy Shavarian. And as I've said earlier, Roger Insull is now dead, so I can't contact him, but I did contact Tracy Shavarian. She is still working as a journalist. She works for a magazine now, I think. And I had a brief Facebook message conversation with her, asking for some further sources about what went into this particular article on the 8th of February. And whether she had actually personally heard the Arthur C. Clarke confession tape. But she said it was so long ago she couldn't remember. So that doesn't really help with the allegations one way or the other. So there's some more transcripted quotes from the supposed tape recording from Clarke, and it's new quotes. But with some crossover with the previous ones. I would be interested to, at the very least, see a full transcript, a full unbroken transcript of the entire conversation. If it lasted 5 minutes, I want to see a full chronological transcript of that tape, but there doesn't seem to be one available. Now, there's a load of new allegations put against Clarke here. I'll read it out as it is, because I don't want to distort it myself through my own paraphrasing. So from the article in the Sunday Mirror, February 8th, 1998, quote, "We also have a copy of a secret document which names Clark as a paedophile known to members of the North American Boy Lovers Association, one of the world's most notorious child sex networks. US detectives who arrested leaders of the association 10 years ago say that Clark was named by other paedophiles they quizzed during an FBI investigation." End quote. I'm just going to stop there because I want to expand on this. The North American Boy Lovers Association, this is a weird, fucking weird organisation. They campaign to have the legal age of consent for children abolished. What the fuck? And they were doing it back then, and they're still going now, but not as strong as they were apparently. And the fact that it's called the North American Boy Lovers Association, or actually no, I think I've misquoted it. The North American Man-Boy Lovers Association. The fact that it's called that suggests that it was all about men who wanted to have sex with boys and not necessarily anything to do with little girls. This article continues, quote, "The perverts had set up children's homes in Thailand as fronts for their sick activities. One of its leaders was Jonathan Tampico, 48, a top nuclear scientist who worked for the American government. He served 2.5 years in jail for molesting a boy of 12 and is now on the run with $1 million warrant on his head for further porn offences. He told detectives he had stayed at Clark's home in Colombo and had swapped letters with the author." Another known paedophile, former church minister John Wakefield Cummings, 56, is serving a 24 years to life sentence after admitting molesting 17 boys in his care. He told police in Sacramento, California, that Clark had been contacted at his Sri Lankan home by a paedophile who was on the run from the American authorities. In a sworn statement made by an investigator for Sacramento's district attorney, Wakefield Cummings told how the pervert fled to Sri Lanka, where he was able to contact the paedophile community through Clark. He then fled from Sri Lanka to Indonesia. Detectives contacted the child welfare group to warn about Clark's activities. A senior Sacramento detective said, quote, "We have never had any reason to take action against Arthur C. Clark because he was outside our jurisdiction," Sri Lanka. "But Clark's name did keep coming up. We were looking into members of the Boy Lovers Association who all seemed to know or be aware of him. He ended up connecting to a lot of people we were investigating. Tampico was one of those who said he went to Sri Lanka. I have seen letters between him and Arthur C. Clarke. There was nothing overtly sexual in them, but they were clearly corresponding," end quote. He added, quote, "Cummings told us in the course of interviews that Arthur C. Clarke is a paedophile. He said Sri Lanka used to be a popular destination for the paedophiles, but then the government changed and they were all thrown out. He said Clarke was one of the few they didn't expel because of his status," end quote. Well, okay, so a lot of statements there alleging that Clark is basically connected to a paedophile network internationally, or at least in America. So, with those kinds of statements, it's important to look up other sources to try and verify or discredit details of the reporting. I mean, it's hard to just take something at face value like that just from words written in the newspaper. Now, I haven't been able to find any other information on the church minister paedophile called John Wakefield Cummings. Haven't found anything on him. But Jonathan Tampico, it was quoted there as being he's described there as a nuclear scientist who was a paedophile who was on the run. Now, that is actually true. I found a US legal archive page from 2002 that confirmed that Tampico was a paedophile and he'd been engaged in child pornography or collecting child pornography. And he was on the run at the time when this article was published. He was on the run. That was in February 1998. I couldn't find any confirmation that Jonathan Tampico travelled to Sri Lanka then or before then. But he was rearrested in Texas that year. And that was after, I think there was a televised most wanted request to find this guy, and then he was found in Texas and rearrested. Okay, so now this final piece in the Mirror, this final article from them on the subject, doesn't really give very specific sources for these quotes about this alleged international paedophile ring association to Arthur C. Clarke. But it does state at one point, quote, Ron O'Grady of ECPAT, which is the End Child Prostitution in Asia Tourism, confirmed he had been warned about Clarke by police in Sacramento, end quote. So I'm going to take a little bit of a guess here, and I'm going to say that the journalists who wrote this particular final piece in the Mirror about Clarke, they may have gotten all of that information from Ron O'Grady at ECPAT. And Ron O'Grady, like many of the people associated with these allegations, has now died, so I can't even contact him to ask. But I suspect that he may have been in possession of some of the documentation because he ran a kids' rights group, and maybe these investigators in America became aware of this stuff. They couldn't do anything against Clarke because it was outside of America, so they may have passed the information on to ECPAT, and then Ron O'Grady may have passed it straight on to the Mirror journalists, and that could be how that information broke there, because the US Legal Archive page from 2002 pretty much matches up with the Mirror's statements on the subject from 1998. So that in itself suggests that there was some credibility in what the Mirror was reporting, or at least that they weren't making it up. Right, so I'm going to try and speed things up a bit here. We've gotten through most of the information, but still there's other very important information as well. Then there's an article in the Irish Times, 17th of February 1998. This one I think it largely defends Clarke. And the author talks about his own personal visit to Clarke in 1992, and he says that he didn't see anything suspicious, and that was about it, for that one. Then the next day, another article in the Independent newspaper, 18th of February 1998. And again, this article stating about there being minimal media attention in Sri Lanka to the allegations against Clarke. And this article claims that the Sri Lankan police had already spoken to Dayananda De Silva. That was the radio host guy, well known in Sri Lanka, who made some statements about Clarke, pretty harsh statements. Says that the police have spoke to him, doesn't say what the results of that conversation were. And the police also said that they would interview the other witnesses. Now, we don't get any follow-up on that about whether they spoke to them or what was said. But the fact that the Independent newspaper, which is entirely separate from the Mirror, is saying that the Sri Lankan police have said that they would interview the other witnesses, this suggests that the witnesses were real people, that their names weren't made up. So that is noteworthy. And then the article goes on to claim that Clarke is a friend of the country's then president, Chandrika Kumaratunga. Chandrika Kumaratunga. I'll try and get my tongue around that one. Says he's a friend of the president, well connected, and says he's got all high-profile connections. And so the article gives the impression that an investigation by Sri Lankan police won't really take place, and that it would likely be, sort of a cover-up to spare embarrassment for Clarke and for the country. And then we get an article almost 2 months later. It doesn't seem to be any more coverage after that until April 6th, 1998, article in the BBC. And it's interesting that the BBC never covered this story at all until this point, which is quite suspicious. The BBC has a lot of resources, had journalists all over the world, and yet they didn't cover this issue at all, as far as I can tell. And when the BBC coverage did come, it was basically to say that Clarke had been found not guilty by the investigating police authorities in Sri Lanka. Now, how the BBC got that lead on that investigation, I don't know. Maybe they were in regular contact with them. Who supplied that information to the BBC so that they could publish about it first, about it being, about Clarke being not guilty because a police investigation says so? Why did no other news sources get the scoop on this, and why did BBC not cover the issue at all until then? This is always an important thing with news media coverage on any story. When a new story breaks, it's just as important to pay attention to which news organisations don't cover the story and why they would not want to cover it. And then when they eventually do cover it, do they take a biased view one way or the other? In this case, it appears to me that the BBC did not want to give any kind of credibility to the allegations against Clarke, and it only finally covered it once it had statements from the Sri Lankan police to say that Clarke was not guilty. And I find the coverage here as lacks credibility, and given the protection of Clarke's reputation by the Sri Lankan news media, which wasn't just reported by the Mirror, this was also reported by the Independent newspaper. I find the Sri Lankan police investigation thing and the lack of evidence, the lack of details about the people they interviewed, about whether they were lying or not, I find the lack of publicly available information about this investigation by Sri Lankan police is seriously dodgy, and it suggests that the whole thing was just covered up. Doesn't mean Clarke was guilty, but I don't think they did a genuine investigation. That's my personal opinion. BBC did another article, 13th of April 1998. And this one's weird. This article actually goes into the question of whether the Arthur C. Clarke tape actually existed. And the BBC claims that the Sri Lankan embassy via Interpol, which is the International Criminal Police Organisation, are awaiting a copy of the taped confession the Sunday Mirror claimed to have. The Sunday Mirror claims it had already sent a copy of the tape to Interpol, quote, who failed to let them know they had not received it, end quote. The Sri Lankan source says it will end its investigation if it doesn't receive the tape. Something weird going on with this tape. I mean, why didn't the BBC, when the allegations first broke, why didn't the BBC come out and cover the issue and say, well, where's this tape? The fact that they didn't do that until months later, I find that strange. There's weird things going on about this tape. And again, it's possible that the so-called confession tape ended up being legally constricted from being passed around, because if Arthur C. Clarke's lawyers had started some sort of a court case, the beginnings of a court case against the Mirror newspaper, it could have led to some sort of a early settlement of that case, and that in turn would mean that the tape would probably mean that the tape would have to be kept under wraps and not be made public, and that may have actually prevented the Mirror from passing the tape around, giving copies out to other organisations. I don't know, but you could also take it that the tape didn't exist. Now, again, it's getting more and more dark here. I am going to put on the big light here as well. All right, so article in the Guardian newspaper, 12th of September 1999. So we're jumping ahead by a good year or so. This is by Tim Avers, writing for the Guardian. And he wrote this piece that it sort of sits on the fence. It doesn't quite accuse Clarke, and it doesn't quite defend him either. Tim Avers went to visit Arthur C. Clarke after the allegations, quite a while afterwards, I think. He describes Clarke's home environment and his servants, and he offers up some other details from Clarke's life. Things like Clarke's father had died when Arthur C. Clarke was 13 years old. I didn't know about that. And it mentions about Clarke's personal archives, which are under lock and key, and Clarke is quoted as saying that they're under lock and key for 30 years after he dies because Quote, there might be all sorts of embarrassing things in them, end quote. And that doesn't prove anything, but it definitely leaves room for speculation as well. So Clark is quoted as denying the allegations. And Clark claims, according to this article, quote, that was very unpleasant, of course, and luckily there was no problem whatsoever. I immediately got the police in and they disproved the whole damn thing, end quote. Now this, I do think Clark was lying on, because as we've seen from the other news sources, the investigation into Clark, or the fake investigation, or non-investigation, whatever you want to call it, that was brought about because, according to these other news sources, not just the Mirror, there was pressure being put on the religious groups, kids' rights groups, and so on. There was a bit of a calling out, and the news media, the world news media, is sort of kicking off about this a little bit as well. That put the pressure on for Sri Lankan police to at least give the impression of doing an investigation. But Clark says that he got the police in right away, but he didn't say that at the time when he was responding to the allegations when they first published. He didn't say, I've got the police in. Here he is like a year or so later saying, oh, I got the police in and they disproved the whole damn thing. So I think he's lying about that. Doesn't prove that the allegations are true, but I think he's made that one up or twisted it. And Clark says, quote, 2 journalists came to interview me. I said nothing that I would have regretted if they'd quoted it accurately. I don't understand their motivation, or I do. He, Clark points to a picture of himself and Prince Charles, was coming, and they wanted to create some embarrassment, but every single one of their facts was refutable. I have signed affidavits, end quote. Okay. So Clark does confirm there that the journalists came to his house and interviewed him. Okay. So that's an important admission from Clark. If he'd have said the journalists never came here at all, what are they talking about? That would be like, oh, okay, what's going on there? But he admits that they did come. And he doesn't say that they completely fabricated all the statements. He just said that he was quoted inaccurately. And that kind of sounds like almost like a veiled confession that he did admit something. But he's saying that his admissions weren't as bad as what they stated or something like that. That's what it sounds like to me. And then when he says, I've got signed affidavits from the police investigation, why would Clark have them? Why would the police provide Clark with copies of those? And as far as I know, he never actually showed these signed affidavits to the journalist. If the journalist had seen them, he could have reported on it and said, yeah, I've seen these statements from Sri Lankan police, and maybe statements about the witnesses and so on, or statements from the witnesses. But he didn't do that. And Clark, I mean, the internet was a big thing back then. Clark could have easily taken the police documents, the signed affidavits, and put them out publicly online to disprove the allegations. But he never did. As far as I know, he never did. So simply claiming I have signed affidavits to a journalist who is in his home and not providing them, this denial from Clark is very inefficient, in my view. It seems like a tentative admission that he had actually let slip something. Okay, and then after that, we jumped to 2012 and we got Graham Johnson's book, Hack, which I've already talked about that quite a bit, and I don't think there's really much else I need to say about that. Oh yeah, there was one quite important issue. This is an awkward one logically, so I'll read this out the way I've got it written here. Graham explains that after getting a confession to sex with 14-year-olds out of Clark, this is me quoting my own notes, by the way, he quickly left and called back to his newspaper to report what he had. There's no statement as to whether Graham travelled back to the UK with the tape to play it for his employers before the article was published, and there might not have been time for that given that the paper wanted to run the story before Clark could be knighted. So, in Clark's defence, we could allege that Graham had only the stories from the ex-Rent Boys and the statements from Dayananda de Silva to go by. And so he had fooled his own newspaper by telephone into running the story, claiming to have a confession tape that didn't exist, but that is as speculative as anything else. Also, if that were true, then surely Graham would have been fired instead of promoted upon his return to the UK. And as Graham states in the book, Clarke never sued the newspaper. So again, we've got all this weird, complex dynamics about this tape. Did the tape exist? And what was said on the tape? Oh, all right. We're definitely past 3/4 of the way through all this information now. Okay, so then we've got a video tour of Clarke's house, and this was posted on YouTube in 2010, but I'm not sure exactly when it was recorded. At about 54 seconds in, the man showing the visitor around the house is touching a framed photo of Leslie Ekenyaki, who was cited at findagrave.com as Clarke's spouse. But we don't get to hear what the tour guide says about this picture. We just see him placing it back on the wall, it seems. Why was that left out of the edit? Okay, now there's a second video tour of Clarke's house. This was posted on YouTube in 2016. As far as I know, both of these videos were recorded after Clarke's death. The Ekenyaki family had basically kept most of Clarke's belongings, his workspace, kept it the way it was when he was alive for visitors to come and see. And this video gives there's video footage inside and outside of Clarke's house, which I've been able to cross-reference with the Google Maps and confirm exactly where the house was, or still is. All right, so this video footage confirms Clarke's ego chamber, as he called it, and it's actually called that in the video, I think. And you know, most of the video is basically exploring his ego chamber, you know, Clarke's self-worship. I'll just mention a little bit of something. I don't want this video to just be oh, look how evil Clarke was. You know, I'm interested in showing some of the humanist sides of Clarke, and I'm interested in exploring the whole issue from, you know, both points of view. You know, maybe he was just innocent, you know, to show a little bit of his humanity. And this ego chamber thing, I mean, some people could, you know, like Angela Lambert published about it in the Daily Mail, and she was like almost angry about it, about how vain he was. But I also feel a little bit kind of sorry for Clarke in that respect, because I always think that when people have to have a shrine to themselves and try to big themselves up for other people and run around saying, oh, look what I've achieved, you know, and do that all the time, and here's my fucking my plaques, here's my achievements, look how much money I've got, or people who need to show off to the world all the time to try and make themselves seem better than everyone else. I always find those people are kind of sad and probably a bit lonely and insecure deep down, and they feel unaccepted by the world, so they need to try and big themselves up to feel accepted. I would always think that, like, you know, famous people who are really relaxed about themselves and they know who they are and their identity is not attached to the idea of being famous, I tend to think that those people have no need to have like an ego chamber type place. They have no need to have a shrine to themselves. They have no need to have plaques and awards placed all over the place in their home in order to feel good. They should know who they are deep down without all that stuff, you know. Your true identity shouldn't be dependent upon how other people see you, you know. So I feel a little bit sorry for him in that respect. And I think some of that may have been tied in with his bisexuality, homosexuality. I think he was probably bisexual to homosexual leanings. He may have felt rejected by the world because of his sexuality, and maybe this ego chamber thing was a kind of a cover for that. So anyway, I won't go over that stuff too much. Okay, but yeah, 8 minutes into this particular video, the guy filming it, he's taken into Clarke's bedroom, or he wanders in there of his own accord, and the bedroom is completely empty. I remember some of the allegations earlier claimed that Clarke had pictures of pornographic pictures of underage boys and girls, I think it said, in a box by his bed, And I think one of the guys making the allegations had said that Clark had pictures of boys all over his bedroom walls. Well, I was thinking, well, if Clark's home environment had been kept the way it was when he died, then hopefully, the camera being taken into his bedroom would give some insight into what his bedroom decor was like. It's a very personal space. But in this footage, they go in there and there's nothing. There's the bed and there's a pillow on the bed, but no blankets or sheets or anything. That's strange. There's one tiny picture in a corner of the room on the wall. Can't even see what the picture is. But everything else is completely cleared out. So you've got Clark's ego chamber space and all that. That's still full of all of his stuff. And the bedroom is empty. So I don't know what to make of that. Maybe Clark had cleared it out himself in his final years, as he was getting older and he was dying. But I don't think I've ever met anybody in my life where I've been to their bedroom and discovered, wow, this person's bedroom is completely empty, yet the rest of the house is full of all kinds of personal stuff. Seems to me like there's been a very specific clear out of Clark's belongings from this bedroom. And it leaves a mystery as to what the bedroom was like when Clark lived in it. What kind of pictures were on his walls? What was on his desks? What was in the drawers in the desks? And I don't know. And I've never seen any personal photos from Clark at this location in his own bedroom. Okay, next up, an article at the Daily Beast, 12th of July 2017. We're still getting more information coming in about this as the years go by. There's little pieces of the puzzle that are all coming in. This article is by John Sykes, and he goes to Clark's house, and he includes quotes from other people who knew Clark and who knew that Clark was gay. For example, American writer Charlie Hulse, apparently he settled in Sri Lanka and claims that Clark moved to Sri Lanka so that he could express his sexuality without causing embarrassment for his own family. Not necessarily pederast behaviour, but certainly his homosexuality, which was not acceptable in the Western world way back then. There's some more stuff about Clark's relationship with the Ekanyaki family, who he was sort of living there with. And there's some statements from Hector himself, and these are important. Quote, Hector would sometimes not see him for weeks despite living across the courtyard. When he did see him, he would ask, "What are you up to, Arthur?" What are you doing, Arthur? And Clark would invariably reply, "Writing a book." End quote. All right, so, that sounds innocent enough, but if even Hector, who, Clark rented the property from him, if he didn't see Clark for weeks, then I would say that means that Hector can't necessarily discredit the allegations against Clark, because if he didn't see him for weeks, how the hell did he know what Clark was up to? And also, as various journalists have reported, Clark would go to the Otter Aquatic Club almost daily, and I don't think Hector would know what he was up to there either. Hector still insists that the sexual allegations were not true. And then John Sykes, the author of this article, he says, quote, "It should be noted that everyone I spoke to in Colombo who knew Clark was adamant that the stories were completely untrue. Quote, he liked young men, say 20, 25, but the idea of him with children, no, end quote, said one friend who did not want to be named." And then John Sykes, the author of this article, he continues on, quote, "It should be noted that everyone I spoke to in Colombo who knew Clark was adamant that the stories were completely untrue." And then he quotes somebody as saying, "He liked young men, say 20, 25, but the idea of him with children, no. And then says, said one friend who did not want to be named, end quote. So the fact that this person didn't want to be named, you could say that the journalist made it up, but then at the same time, the journalist is saying that everybody he spoke to said that, who knew Clark, said he was, the allegations were untrue. But how would they know? It's not like paedophiles and pederasts go around and say, oh, are you my friend? I'll tell you about what's going on. a lot of the time when people are found out to be paedophiles or pederasts, even their own close family members and stuff, even people who lived with them for years are often shocked by the revelations, even if the person is found guilty and sent to prison. So this is a bit funny. And then the guy saying, or the woman, don't know if it's a man or a woman who said it, but saying that he liked young men aged 20 to 25, but the idea of him with children, no. How old was Clark when he liked men of 20 to 25? Was he 50, 60, 70? I don't know. It's not much of a statement in Clark's defence. And also, it says the idea of him with children, no. Well, it wasn't necessarily children that was the allegation. It was pederasty. It was pubescent boys between like the ages of 13 and 16. That is not addressed in that quote. And then John Sykes makes some more statements. Quote, however, the crowd Clark hung out with was seen by some as lecherous toward younger native men. Another expatriate in Gali said that Clark and his friends were collectively known as the lizards. We just stayed away from them. End quote. Okay, so this is like 2017, many years later, and you've got this other journalist, John Sykes, who's over there interviewing people, and the stuff that he's describing here doesn't exactly make much of a defence for Clark. So apparently Hector acknowledged to this journalist that Clark was gay, but states that he had had no regular lover or relationship. That seems to be the general story with Clark, but I don't know, I'm not sure I believe that. And he also admits that Clark was a mystery to him in some ways. So that's a weird, interesting article, 2017. And this one is a crucial article. This is, wow, I was like pretty stunned to come across this one. I heard this mentioned in one forum, and I otherwise would never have found it because Arthur C. Clarke isn't actually named in the piece. This is an article in Vice magazine, 17th July 2017. And the article is by Graham Isidore. He's a journalist there in Toronto, Canada. And he gives some quotes from various friends of his about childhood experiences that affected them. And one of those stories appears to be about Arthur C. Clarke, and it almost certainly is if it's true. Okay, so I'm gonna read this out in full because I don't want to put my own twist on it. I want you to hear it the way it's written. Quote, I grew up in... Oh, by the way, yeah, this article is cited as being by a fellow named Peter Troyer, Troyer. Here's Peter Troyer's description of his childhood experience. Quote, I grew up in Sri Lanka. My dad was doing some work for the Canadian government. There were a lot of expat kids in my area, and we had free reign of the neighbourhood. Our parents mostly let us do what we wanted, but we were told to stay away, never go near a large property that bordered my house. When we asked why, the reasons were always vague. There were some rumours that somebody very famous or maybe powerful lived there. We all got the sense that he was a danger in some way. One day I was home sick from school. My grandfather was visiting from Canada and he was assigned to watch me. I remember that I was in my pyjamas. We were in the backyard and my grandfather was painting peacocks. Out of our hedges, this man appeared and approached us. I instantly knew it was the man from the property. The man from the property wanted something from my dad, who of course wasn't home. My grandfather was starstruck by the man. Grandpa could barely speak. The two began chatting. The man flattered my grandfather's painting. He said he also liked to paint, but only people. The man looked toward me and said, let's paint the boy. I was placed on a stool in front of the two men. I was 11 years old. Very quickly, the neighbour said the clothes were spoiling the beauty of me. He asked me to remove my clothes. I looked at my grandpa and did as I was told. Soon after, I was on the stool, naked and crying. I didn't know how long this went on, but at some point my father arrived home. He quickly reviewed the scene, saw the man from the property and went nuts. He just lost it on them, raising his voice, getting in people's faces. I honestly thought he might kill them both. Within a couple of hours, my grandfather was gone and they never, ever spoke again. although in some circles it was common knowledge the man from the property was a famous British science fiction novelist. Apparently he had been banished to then Ceylon, Sri Lanka, from post-war Britain rather than face prison for being a pederast. I think about that day sometimes. My father didn't have a temper and rarely ever raised his voice, but the man he became in that moment was essentially unrecognisable. While we've had our ups and downs from that moment forward, I never questioned his love for me again, ever. I knew he'd kill for me. I learned how important it is to protect your family and those more vulnerable than you." End quote. Whoa! So, a famous British sci-fi novelist who was apparently a pederast. I mean, first of all, famous British sci-fi novelist in Sri Lanka. Who the hell is that going to be? It's going to be Arthur C. Clarke. How many famous British sci-fi novelists settled there? It's got to be Clarke. And the boy at age 11, that kind of fits in with the pubescent age that Clarke has been alleged to have been physically attracted to young boys. Although the point that is said that, where is it? Apparently he had been banished to Sri Lanka from post-war Britain rather than face prison for being a pederast. Really not sure about that one, because as far as I know, Arthur C. Clarke returned to America and Britain, I believe, to work on 2001: Space Odyssey with Stanley Kubrick. But of course, we don't get an exact year for these allegations for this particular event regarding this kid being made to be naked and painted. That could have been after 1969, I'm not sure. Now, I was wondering, as you see this this article, and it seems to be pretty clearly talking about Arthur C. Clarke. I was wondering, did Peter Troyer actually know that he was talking about Arthur C. Clarke? And did the journalist Graham Isidore, who wrote this article, compiled the stories from his friends, did he know it was Arthur C. Clarke? Neither of them might have even realised who they were talking about when they published this piece. If they wanted to hide the identity of Arthur C. Clarke, they could have just not called him a famous British sci-fi novelist. So, it appears to me that they didn't even know who they were talking about. And also, Clarke had died in 2008, so there wasn't any risk of being sued by Arthur C. Clarke for publishing this article in 2017. Now, we could just pass off this story as hearsay, so I went and did a lot of digging around to find out if this Peter Troyer really existed. Unfortunately, Troyer is an unusual last name, so I cross-referenced that with Sri Lanka, did some internet searches, and I found out that there was a Troyer family who did live in Sri Lanka, who'd gone there from Canada to Sri Lanka, lived there for a while around about the time that this stuff was meant to happen, and then that Troyer family went back to Canada. And this particular Peter Troyer was friends with Graham Isidore in Toronto. They are Facebook friends, and Graham Isidore is the one who wrote the story based upon his friend's childhood experiences. There's hardly any Troyer families around. It's a very rare name. I think it's more rare than my last name. So how many Peter Troyer families, how many Troyer families are there who went to Sri Lanka and came back to America, and then Peter Troyer is friends with Graham Isidore on Facebook? And also, his father was quite well known. Warner Troyer was his name. And Warner Troyer, there's a Wikipedia page on him, and it gives the names of his kids, and one of his kids is named Peter. So all of that seems to add up. It seems that this Peter Troyer does really exist. And on that basis, it would be Warner Troyer who kicked off on Arthur C. Clarke, allegedly, and threw him out of the garden for insisting that his son be naked to be painted. So that's a hell of a find. It wasn't my find. Somebody else on the forum had described this. And I thought, yeah, that's got to go into this study. Oh, okay. So now we come to this is the last piece of information in the whole chronological timeline thing. This is Hector Ekanyaki being interviewed on YouTube, posted 2018. and he's talking about Arthur C. Clarke, his lifelong friend. He gives some basic descriptions about how Clarke came to Sri Lanka with Mike Wilson and so on. And the interesting part of his very short interview comes at about the 2-minute mark, and I'll just play it on screen for you. And I'll have the subtitles of that video turned on so that you can read the subtitles and listen to him, because his English is very hard to understand. But when you combine it with the subtitles, you do get a pretty good idea of what he's saying. So I'm just going to show that on screen now. Pay attention to this.
When anybody come to see Arthur about these things, he always help him. Okay? He will never say no. Even if he's sick, he get them to come and ask them to sit in the library and ask him to read a book or something until he get come out of the bedroom, you know. So he's very helpful for people. Anybody who come to see him.
Okay, so that's quite a statement. I mean, he's saying that people would come to Clarke for help. Who were these people? How old were they? Were they male, female? And why would he wait and read a book until they came out the bedroom? What the hell? And that kind of almost matches up with the statements that were made by Dayananda De Silva and the people who were quoted in the Sunday Mirror article about going to see Clarke for money, the use of rent boys and so on, and anybody who needed money. If it was young boys, you know, Clarke would see them privately. And Hector isn't saying that Clarke used rent boys, but his statements about people coming to visit Clarke for help, for presumably financial help, and then he would wait until they came out the bedroom. Okay. I mean, I don't believe that Hector knew about Clarke doing all this stuff if he did it. Like I've said before, you get sex criminals who manage to keep it a secret from the family members. You know, you can get people living in the same household, and there can be one parent who's sexually abusing the kids, or there can be one sibling who's abusing another kid, and that can go on for years. And the same people who live in the household never find out that it happens, because it's done in private when the other people aren't there, and the abuser manages to persuade the victim to keep their mouth shut about it. That happens so many times. So maybe this stuff was happening under Hector's nose and he just was unable to spot it. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop it there. What I will say before I go is that I have got a really big, detailed, well-sourced article on my website about this entire issue, and I've been referencing this article throughout this video as we go along. The article on my site is called The Dark Side of Arthur C. Clarke. It's 43 pages long, because I spent 2 weeks exploring this issue and gathering all the information and organising it into a chronological timeline, because I wanted to get my head around it. And yeah, that article, if you want to dig into this stuff in even more detail, the article is available on my site, and I'll put it in the link. I'll put the link in the video description below. And I do give some conclusions at the end of the article, a more detailed, I actually give a section at the end of the article, which is called The Case for Arthur C. Clarke's Guilt. And I also do another follow-up section called The Case for Arthur C. Clarke's Innocence. So I try and present the two views as best as I can, because I want to be as unbiased in this as I possibly can. What I will say, that based on all of the information that I've looked at, I would say I lean 75% towards Clarke's guilt. I believe he probably was a pederast and possibly a paedophile. Pederasty with rent boys, I believe that was probably true. I've no idea when he started doing that. I've no idea how many years it went on. I've no idea how old he was when it stopped, because I don't think he was able to do it in old age, and who knows though. I think something went on like that. I find his move to Sri Lanka, a place that is renowned for sex tourism and rent boys and stuff, a man with such a glittering career, to move to there and just stay there for the rest of his life, I find that suspicious. And the various allegations against him, not just coming from the Mirror newspaper, but other sources, other journalists describing things they've seen, and these other sources that I've given, I lean strongly towards it now. Like I said, I'm interested in Arthur C. Clarke's mentality. I want to know what made the man tick. And I've been noticing over the years, in looking at his writings and his interviews, there's a very elitist, entitled, almost disconnected from reality view of the world that Clarke had. And he seems to have like a disdain for humanity. This just sounds bizarre, but he talked about the future and man's evolution to the stars and all that kind of thing. But he seemed to have a disdain for the real world human civilization that he lived in. He didn't like biological man. And, he talked in one of his BBC interviews from 1964. He did a presentation for BBC where he said that humans should domesticate monkeys and turn them into our slaves. And that for me was a big red flag. I was like, what the hell? He's going to take a whole species and just enslave it? You believe in that stuff? And then you have all these reports of him living in Sri Lanka where there's so many poor people and rent boys and stuff, and he's super rich and famous. And there's all these reports of, people slaving over him and him being protected and from allegations, and young men running around after him and stuff like that. It's all so weird. I lean quite strongly, 75%, toward him having been a pederast at the very least, and possibly a paedophile. Okay, so give me some feedback in the comments section. What do you think? Which parts do you find convincing, not convincing? What have I missed? Have you found any other sources? I'm very interested to hear what you've got to say. You've been listening to Rob Ager of collativelearning.com. There's tons more articles, videos, studies of all kinds of things that are over on the website. If you're after more content, because I've been quite slow at getting new content out the last month or so, then you can go to the website and place some orders, order some downloadable videos. Thousands of people have done it before. It's all safe, and a lot of satisfied customers. So yeah, head over to the site and do that. Or you can sign up to me on Patreon and get access to about 12, 14, it might even be 16 hours worth of extra material there. If you're interested in merchandise, don't forget, we've got the cups, we've got the t-shirts and so on. The link is in the video description for that. And you can follow my work on Facebook and Twitter as well. Links are in the video description there too. Thanks for watching, folks. Take it easy, and bye-bye.